very shortly, this meeting is organized by TransformDanmark, Global Aktion, Friends of the Earth, and Extinction Rebellion. And they have all helped to organize and to advertise and so on, and many of you may have seen the advertisements. Next, I'm going to welcome Sabrina Fernandes, and we are very, very happy to see you here. Yeah, we saw you online. We had a conference in the spring in March, and we saw you online. So we are very happy to be able to receive you live.
It's perfect. I've been looking forward to it. So,
yes. Yeah. So, and there will be an audience here, and there's also an audience online.
Okay.
At the same time.
That camera over there?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, that's it. Yeah. So I wish to shortly introduce Sabrina. I'm sure you have all read about Sabrina because we have sent out a lot of information. But Sabrina is a Brazilian climate activist, but also a researcher in political ecology. And you work in Brasilia, in Brazil, and you have also been connected to the Overshoot Foundation, as well as the Vienna University as a researcher. I'm not going to introduce very much more concerning that because I'm sure that Sabrina's presentation will say everything about this. We have Sabrina has been here, we're very happy that Sabrina is here. She was actually in Vienna at the time of our conference last spring, and we knew that she was going to stay on in Europe. And that's why we had an agreement already at that time that Sabrina would go to Copenhagen and to have this public meeting. We agreed that around that time. And so this was an extremely good idea, and you are certainly going to have a first-hand impression now of Sabrina's work and especially on her views on the climate issue, especially important after the latest IPCC report, the UN report on climate change, which came out in August this year, especially after that. And we have our title for this meeting is actually inspired by that. Climate change, what is changing? Question mark. What is changing? And we hope that Sabrina can tell us a little more about this. You have been in Aalborg University to speak during your tour here, and you arrived on Thursday evening. Yes. And you had a lecture at Aalborg University on Friday. Today you have had a lecture at Lund University, and this is why there's a bit lateness of the meeting, but we all excuse you for that. And tomorrow morning there will be a lecture at Copenhagen University, and that's on Brazil, Latin America in particular, and it's the Latin America section of the university. And we actually sent out information about the room where it was going to take place. It's at 10:15 tomorrow morning at Copenhagen University. Then Global Aktion has been so good to provide some Zoom for us, one of our co-organizers, Global Aktion. And then I'm going to say a little about the program very shortly, what is going to take place. Sabrina is going to have a presentation that is going to take around 45 minutes or something like this. Then we have invited a discussant who is Vasna Ramasa. Vasna Ramasa, that is pronounced the right way. Vasna is working on the same issues at Lund University. And what is more exciting, Vasna also comes from South Africa. So she has a different approach than the one Sabrina has. And that makes it very interesting that Vasna will ask some questions afterwards. After Vasna's questions, we're going to have a break where you can buy some books. And after the break, we'll continue until 9:30, around 9:30 or 21:30. We know that some advertisements, it has said you are going to finish at 9, in others at 9:30. But with the presentation and the time that we are at now, we think that it's best that we continue until 9:30. I hope it's okay for you with the Zoom. Okay, thanks a lot. So I will pass on the floor to Sabrina, and thanks again very much for coming here.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for coming tonight. It's a pleasure to be here in Copenhagen. I had been looking forward to it when Hans told me about the idea of coming. Can you hear me in the back? Like at this level? Okay, good. Was at Award and Loan today, so I think it's like my third talk today, and there's another one tomorrow. But I'm very happy to different topics everywhere, and they're all connected to my research and my activism. I define myself as a scholar activist, and I've been doing that kind of work most of my time. So making sure that my research is always engaged in a project for changing society, changing the world. And I think that with the situation that we're in right now, with this ecological crisis getting more and more intense, the effects being felt everywhere, this calls for some urgency. I don't know if you've seen the news, for example, there's a cyclone in Saudi Arabia. Oman is basically under water at this moment. And we know that this kind of extreme weather events, they're getting more and more common, and there's enough scientific evidence nowadays to connect this to climate change. So it's not just random extreme weather events anymore. These are events that are connected to global warming because we have gone beyond 1.1 degrees Celsius, and we are definitely headed for 1.5. So a big change that came out from this IPCC report that we had access to in August of this year is that whereas before we were talking about, well, let's try to stay under 1.5 preferably, and then under 2.0 degrees Celsius, now we definitely know we're reaching 1.5. The literature is very affirmative in that situation. Something else that came out of this IPCC report was that they are absolutely certain, and they had been stating things like that before, but this time they were very emphatic in this on this point, that this is a human-made situation. So this is anthropogenic. This is not just some random warming that could be happening because, well, nature is changing, like usually climate denialists claim, right? So you've seen like climate denial saying it has something to do with volcanoes. I've even heard things like the sun is getting warmer. So there's all sorts of claims that are made. And unfortunately, these are claims that make it into governments sometimes. It gets into policy making. So I come from a country where the government is quite engaged in climate denialism, a country where the foreign minister for a really long time kept not only engaging with climate denialism, but all sorts of conspiracy theories. So this has influenced the fact that for a while, Brazil under the Workers' Party was actually leaving a good impression in terms of cutting on deforestation and trying to be a leader at these UN climate conferences that we have every year. And I'll get to that eventually today. Well, the word's pariah. The worst thing that could happen is that getting someone that's very anti-ecological and engaged in climate denial, taking care of a country that's high on emissions and that's very strategic for curbing emissions, because, well, we know a large part of the Amazon is located in Brazil. And I know this is a matter of concern because when the Amazon is burning, this is not a problem just for us in Brazil. It is a problem everywhere. We now have scientific evidence as well that the Amazon forest is now emitting more carbon than it was stocking. This is the level of deforestation. So not only we have to stop this deforestation, we actually have to rebuild the forest. The Amazonian forest is not like just a random occurrence. There's anthropological evidence that the forest was slowly built by traditional original communities there, like indigenous communities, over thousands of years. So by hunting and gathering and spreading seeds around, so that biodiversity is also human legacy, and it's being destroyed. This report was very important because it shows us the problems related to the fossil fuel industry. And by all means, a lot of our focus has to be there because we're dealing with a major part of the emissions still coming from the fossil fuel industries. But we're also dealing with emissions that come, for example, from land use change. So when we're talking about deforestation, turning forest into just a place for you to put a lot of cattle to graze on and things like that, this also contributes to climate change. In fact, we even have greenhouse gas emissions that come from when you have degraded pasture. So you can put animals to graze on that, and then eventually it gets degraded. So once that soil comes into contact directly with the sun, and there's like, we're not fixating, for example, nitrogen in it anymore through plants, this is also contributing to emissions. Something else that's important in the report is that we cannot overlook how animal exploitation is also part of emissions, right? And this is not just connected directly to methane emissions coming from bovines, for example, but the fact that this is all connected, right? So agribusiness in the Brazilian Amazon, they're cutting down forests, so that adds to land use change, to make pasture, to put animals on it that then are going to be partly fed through that pasture, but also there are soy monocrops, and the soy monocrops, they're going to come with fertilizers, and that's going to add to greenhouse gas emissions. And then those soy crops are being used to feed animals somewhere else. And then what we have here is really a snowball. Things are accumulating. And when we think about accumulating, we also think about the fact that even if we stop all emissions today, things are still going to continue to get worse for a while, because we have enough greenhouse gases accumulated in the atmosphere to the point that it will continue to compound in effects for a really long time. So if this is warming, then you're going to have permafrost melting, and then that leads to seawater level risings, and that leads to differences in terms of like rainfall patterns. So that's going to affect how we grow our food. And this affects how we grow our food. This also affects land use change again. So it's really a matter of understanding that action needs to be radical, and it needs to be as soon as possible because we are already behind. But other than that, I don't know if you've heard of this, there was a leak for the third part of this report. So this is the sixth assessment report coming from the IPCC. It came out in August, and then the second part on impacts. So the first one is more general, the second part on impacts coming out in January, and then in March, the one on adaptation and mitigation. However, part of the scientific community, very afraid of what we call whitewashing, which means government policymakers that are helping to oversee these, the national IPCC panels in each country. Usually they take the report and they're like, well, this is a little bit too radical, we don't agree on this, and reports the language and ends up a little adapted. And scientists, a group of scientists involved in the first draft of the third part of the report that comes out next year decided to leak the report. And like this report actually was leaked through a branch of Extinction Rebellion, right, with the scientist rebellion. And that was excellent. This leak, it was very important for us because this is something we have been quite concerned about. The whole discussion, for example, like fighting climate denialism, it leads us to say, well, people need to start believing the science. We need to listen to scientists because, well, the data is there. But climate denialism actually comes in many forms. Obviously, you're going to get the Bolsonaros and the Trumps, but it's not just that. We also have climate denialism in the sense of watering down the science to make sure that we can still make room for a system that's very destructive of nature, that is capitalism. And even though the leaked report doesn't name capitalism directly as the source of this, it shows the need for certain adaptations and mitigations and certain diagnoses that make it quite clear that without very strong structural change regarding our economic system, we won't be able to actually curb going beyond 2.0, let alone 1.5, right? And if we look at policy as it is today, even if we consider the Paris Accord, the vast majority of the signatories of the Paris Agreement are not at all close to actually living by the goals that they established. We only have like about 2 countries in the world that are actually like coming close to it, like Gambia and Morocco, and everyone else is quite behind. And obviously, this also means that the big emitters are very, very much behind. So when Trump pulled away of the agreement and then Bolsonaro pulled away from the agreement, this was quite worrisome. But when Joe Biden comes back into the agreement and he calls for the summit with world leaders that happened in the first semester, people thought, oh, maybe he might actually engage into living by the agreement. But that's not the current reality with the Biden administration. There's actually a lot of greenwashing, trying to look greener than it actually does. They're still very much aligned with the fossil fuel industry in the United States, and calls for a Green New Deal there. They're still very much on the margins. And in fact, the attacks coming against the Green New Deal, even like a more moderate version of the Green New Deal, these are still like attacks that come even from like the moderate progressives, because, well, the oil lobby is quite involved in everything, and there's this tendency of thinking that we have more time, and that the scientists are just like ringing this alarm for no reason. But the reason I said this about believing the scientists is that I also think that we need to expand our notion here when we're talking about climate scientists. So when we look at the IPCC panel, we have climate scientists who are engaged in earth sciences. They're really breaking down the data on the chemistry behind greenhouse gases and these compounding effects. But we have a lot of social scientists also working on climate change that also need to be heard, because social scientists are quite important for understanding the social impacts and understanding how can we actually make these changes happen? How can we build consent around it? What kind of participation from society that we need to ensure that this actually happens? Because we can't just live thinking that, well, the policymakers at the highest levels, they're just going to think better about it because, well, this report came out and changed everything. We need to mobilize society. And there are many levels of social science around climate change that are important for mobilizing society. And not just the scientific community, right? We need to make sure that we have journalists who are quite engaged on this as well. So we need to make sure that proper knowledge is being shared and not just on the numbers. The numbers are very important, but they're not, we've seen, they're not enough to convince people. We need to work on policy making from bottom up. One thing that came out on the report, the leaked report, and I'm just going to read like a small section for you. So this was the working group 3 working on adaptation and mitigation. And they say like this: limiting warming to below 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels requires rapid greenhouse gas emissions reductions and fundamental structural changes at global scale. Then they put it in brackets, high confidence. And this is the way that the IPCC evaluates the level of consensus in the scientific literature they reviewed, because it's part of the work, grabbing like this huge body of scientific work that comes out of this and evaluating what is the consensus around it. And then they say, weaker near-term action would place limiting warming to these levels out of reach, as it would entail assumptions about subsequent accelerated policy development and technology development and deployment inconsistent with evidence and projections in the assessed literature. High confidence. What the second part means here is quite important for us, because it gets into this whole conversation about false solutions. And that's basically the standard right now. Going to be in Glasgow next month. We have COP26 happenings. My understanding that members of the organizations present here today are going to Glasgow as well. And one thing that I've understood after quite a while is that at the part with the actual UN, so like that part where you have the delegations of the countries, that what we have there is a legitimizing process, that even those with the best intentions for making sure that these negotiations will come out of this limbo where they run into a wall. They run into a wall because there are different perspectives from each country on what matters in terms of development for those countries. There's this huge undermining of the impacts that they might not be so bad. But there's also another level, something that worries me very much, which is this idea that, well, we can actually just keep pushing this barrier because, well, there's like these geoengineering tactics and technologies that are being developed and they're going to help us in the long term. So we're just like betting on the future based on technological developments that, yes, if some of these work at a global scale, this is going to be very good for us, not only to stabilize, but to actually bring it down. But once you go over certain limits, and this is what the IPCC calls the overshoot problem. Like, so even if you go over 1.5 and then through these, for example, carbon capture technologies, you come back to 1.3 or something, you already set a lot of systems in motion. So a lot of things you can come back from. In August, they were very, very clear about the fact that, well, some things are irreversible. Once you have permafrost melting, you can't build a giant freezer and just like put these things back together. You're going to have rising seawater levels. This is very worrisome for coastal areas, like here, and also in particular small island countries that suffer from a problem of infrastructure and who may be actually hit by other problems as well beyond rising seawater levels, such as more extreme weather events connected, for example, to hurricanes. And when we're talking about hurricanes, we're not talking just about when a hurricane like grade 5 comes in and blasts through an island for days. We're talking also about when the hurricane comes in, it creates like a new sort of like temporary situation of seawater rise. So you might lead to flooding for a really long time in these islands. A big example that we have of this was in 2019 when the Bahamas was plundered by a hurricane for days, 5-degree hurricane just sitting there on top of the Bahamas for days. And when they left, they were still dealing with these very high water levels, and that meant like a lot of people went homeless. And you know, you don't have insurance to cover these things, and then the country has to ask for aid and then has to go in debt because of this. So for small island countries and countries in the global south in general, having to deal with mitigating these impacts time after time, it also means continue on a path of underdevelopment because your resources are not going to be put where they should be put in terms of like healthcare, education, and improving the lives of their peoples. It's just about trying to put out these fires that are going to happen more and more often. Something else that we know is quite clear that we're now going to be able to recover fastly from is the fact that, well, once you go over certain levels of ocean acidification, biodiversity loss can be permanent. And that also means a lot when we're talking about coral reefs. And it is quite worrisome that for some people, the solution for that is that let's just experiment with technology around this. There's very little, in fact, agreement on the ethics of some of these geoengineering experiments, like what are the bodies of governance that should actually be overseeing some of these experiments coming out of geoengineering. And this is just flying by because this is quite convenient for the capitalist system because you get to keep fossil fuel corporations going with their business as usual, and you also create other markets. And you can say, well, we can continue to extract because, well, look at that. We'll be able to fix the greenhouse gas problem very easily later by, you know, capturing carbon, or for example, spraying things into the atmosphere, which is one of the technological studies that become more prominent over the past few months because Bill Gates has been funding some of these studies. And talking about Bill Gates is something that worries me a lot because he has tried to make himself the messenger on what to do regarding climate change. Like one of the best sold books on climate change today is the Bill Gates book. This is something that should worry everyone, in fact, that is very much concerned with his own investment portfolio and dealing with his own billionaire guilt, right? So I'm an imperfect messenger, I have a huge carbon footprint and things like that. And all of a sudden it makes it look like his problem is only his carbon footprint, and not the fact that he has been perpetuating a system that's leading to this problem right now, and now perpetuating false solutions that perhaps in so many decades we might get into a certain level of viability that might help us at a certain point. So I don't mean to be completely anti-technological advancements and studies in terms of mitigating the effects of climate change. But we need to be quite clear that these technologies are not something we should be betting our lives on. Like, so if we're like all together in a boat and the boat is sinking, we shouldn't be saying that, well, but someone is going to build a lifeboat. Like I can see like they're doing that in a lab somewhere. The boat is already sinking. So our situation right now is like, can we repair it? The actual part of the boat sinking, is that boat repairable? Up to a certain extent, yes. And this is what we need to focus on right now. This report, and I'm going to go back to the leaked part on it as well, is that they were also quite clear that emissions different coming from different places. So we are all in the same boat, but some of us are in first class, some of us are right there in the bottom, right? And that means also that who gets the first lifeboats, right? The ones that are available. So we all go back to the old like Titanic metaphor, like inequality in a boat that's sinking. And this is basically our planet right now. This is important to highlight because we have two big movements, like political movements happening right now. There is a discussion around Green Deals, and that's quite important, and we should by all means continue with that, but those are not all uniform. And it doesn't mean that these Green Deal discussions are actually taking social justice, climate justice at an international level into account. A lot of these Green Deal discussions are very much regionally based, domestic based. It's about, well, how we're going to put these many funds to, if we need to stop our fossil fuel industry, how can we save those workers, and how we can change everything to renewables. And that leaves open a lot of questions. For example, if we're going to electrify an entire country in the global north, and we're going to bet on this based on wind turbines offshore and onshore, if we're going to be doing this through solar panels, and if we're going to be using geothermal and all of the variety of renewable options, we're going to need to mine. So minerals are key in this conversation. That's one part of it. The other part of it is this discussion that is part of what I've been focusing on in my time here in Europe, that the far right has begun to engage with. So we have like a far right that's very much into climate denial. And when I was in Aalborg, the Zetkin Collective, together with Andres Malk, we were talking about some of these studies. They published a book very recently called White Skins, Black Fuel, a thick book, but it's basically an encyclopedia on these fascist movements and how they're connected to fossil fuels and what they've been calling fossil fascism. But there's also another side of the far right that has understood that, well, there are people that are actually getting worried about climate change. Because, you know, we had like during summer here, all of those floods, right? Germany, Switzerland, and the heat wave, like it was very, very hot in Italy, and then people died in Canada. So how can we capture these people for the far right? And that comes into the dangers of eco-fascism. So there are already conversations within the far right, which is about, well, yes, climate change is happening, and the problem is the immigrants. They're coming, they're using our resources, we have very limited resources. So if we keep letting these people in, it's going to be a problem. And where are we going to put them? And then we're going to have to, like, you know, take away some of our national parks to put them, and it creates all of this panic around it, which is a perfect way of merging the standard racism and white supremacist thinking that comes out of the far right with some sort of environmental concern. So that's quite dangerous. I've seen like part of the far right in Austria using this, and there's like a far right movement in North America that has been using this, and even so much appropriating indigenous symbols and discourses to make it look like they belong to the land, so outsiders get out and things like that, right? Or getting to even to the point like in Austria, well, we're not calling for deportation, we're calling for remigration. And then they can, you know, take care of their own things somewhere else. These are all very worrisome. Eco-fascism is something that we have to be aware of. But the best way to fight eco-fascism is through a proper ecological alternative to capitalism. So we can make sure that people don't fall through these cracks and get seduced by this kind of discourse. But that means that it's not enough to look at the problem of climate change only through local perspectives. By all means, it's very important for us, wherever we are, if, you know, we have our collectives and we can reorganize things and build communities towards more sustainable goals, and thinking about how can we have community gardens and how can we improve mobility in our cities, and, you know, change how we plan things locally. But once we get into the topic of green extractivism, which is this new level of discussions around which minerals do we need towards renewables, things get a lot more complicated, because then we are required to look at where do things come from, which is a question that the capitalist system tries to hide all the time, right? So it's the same old story behind commodity fetishism. We don't know who produced their things, so it doesn't hurt because you can see the exploitation behind it. And that also, when we're looking into resources, is also part of the problem. It's coming from somewhere else. Yeah, well, there's probably regulations there or something like that. And that gets into some quite complicated situations. And I'm going to give you an example here. I read this piece last year on the Political website, and I'm just going to quote just like a little fraction of it to frame this problem for you. It says like this: any talk of increasing extraction within the European Union is going to anger environmentalists opposed to seeing landscapes scarred by mining projects. Lithium mining projects in Extremadura in Spain and northern Portugal have led to protests from local activists who say that the schemes will generate pollution and destroy unique natural habitats. So it's perfectly understandable that environmentalists in Spain and Portugal don't want these mining projects in their backyard. The lithium can lead to like very toxic mining, right? But at the same time, we've been talking about green deals that not only talk about changing our reliance from fossil fuels towards renewable, but actually expanding our reliance on renewables. So it's not just about how can we turn our public transportation system into completely based on renewables. It's also about how can we get these like fancy new electric cars. Right? It's also about how can we keep this very high standard of living that only from part of middle class up actually have access to, because a huge part of the working class in Europe, in the United States, in Canada, in Australia, they don't have access to that high standard of living. But we're still going to promote this as if this was what defined our lives in these places. And then a fraction of the people in those places are still going to keep enjoying excess, but now it's going to be powered by solar. So wonderful. And then where are the minerals coming from? The cost for implementing wind and solar has been falling for a long time now. This is quite positive, but it has also been falling. Like the fact that it's falling is amazing because it means that when we're comparing to fossil fuels, it's going to become more efficient, it's going to be easier to implement and things like that. But like fossil fuels, the cost falls because nature costs nothing. You have cost for extraction, you have cost for perhaps concessions, operations, transportations, but nature is free. And then these other costs are even cheaper if they're coming from countries where we have overexploitation of labor at very, very low cost. So cheap labor. Labor with very few safety regulations around it. And that means, like for many of these minerals, it means Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Southeast Asia. Okay. I made a list of some of the minerals that we're going to need for transition, and I'm going to just mention to you where these are coming from, right? So lithium, of course, the major source of lithium today is Chile. There's a huge lithium reserve on the borders like Chile, Argentina, and Bolivia. Bolivian lithium is quite not to the point of being valuable for extraction because it's not good quality lithium, but believe me, in 30 or 40 years, they're going to find it interesting. Australia, and sometimes that's perceived as, wow, this is, oh, it's Australia. Australia is developed, so it's fine to get lithium from that. It's not leading to that much conflict. Well, Australia is a country of settler colonialism, right? So we're talking here about indigenous territories that were not settled, there were not like proper reparations for this colonialism that's still ongoing. When we look into Australia, we can also consider that overlooking this is overlooking what we're calling now green sacrifice zones. So these areas of the world that because they have these minerals, well, too bad, we're gonna need to extract them anyway. So who cares what happens? A lot of the lithium production is coming from China as well, and China is quite well positioned in this matter because China also holds the largest reserves of rare earth minerals. Rare earth minerals are actually quite abundant. They're not rare at all, but they're really spread out, and mining for them is complicated and involves a lot of other toxic byproducts, for example, mercury, right? So 71% of the production of rare earth is coming from China right now. Graphite. Graphite is coming from China, India, Brazil, North Korea. Cobalt, Congo, majority of cobalt coming from Congo, Canada, China, Russia, Zambia, Australia, Cuba. Nickel, Russia, Indonesia, Philippines, Canada, Australia, New Caledonia, Brazil. Copper, Chile, Peru, China, United States, Australia, Zambia. Lead, China, Australia, US, Peru, Mexico, India. Chromium, South Africa, Kazakhstan, India, Turkey. Silver, Mexico, China, Peru, Australia, Chile. Just a couple to mention here. These are all minerals that are strategic for the renewable industry. Some are going to become even more strategic as we are having some technological changes. So for example, zinc, because now there's been some advancements in the production of zinc air batteries, and those are actually much better than lithium for certain applications. And zinc air batteries, in the way it's produced and it's designed and the actual properties of the materials, they're usually a little easier to recycle. So that's also good news. But in general, what we have here is that a lot of these minerals, they're located in places where we don't have enough regulation where cost of labor is quite cheap, and where big multinational mining corporations are already very located. When I think of like Latin America and mining companies, I think of Canadian mining companies. And if you look into this organization called Mining Watch, you're going to find tons of evidence of abuses by mining companies in Latin America. And this makes it very convenient because, well, we're not going to extract lithium here in Portugal and Spain. We're not going to do that. We don't want to scar our landscape. Well, look, in Chile, they're already producing it. So let's just keep taking it from there. When in fact, we know that in certain parts of Chile, the land is not good for growing food anymore. And there are concerns around the toxic levels around water because of the refining process around lithium, right? So these are the green sacrifice zones. And the majority of the green sacrifice zones are in the global south or in unsettled indigenous territories in the global north. This is quite worrisome. And this is not being taken into account in the majority of the Green Deal conversations. This is not being taken into account in the majority of conversations, even within the climate justice movement. And I don't mean to like be I do mean, I'm gonna bring bad news, but the organizations in Europe, such as Eurometaux, that's an association that represents the mining industry in Europe, they actually pretending to care about what's happening in the global south, to say that, well, it's risky for Europe to depend on minerals coming from somewhere else. A few years ago, there was even a report from another association that ascribed political risk grades to different countries, saying that, well, the European Union can't depend on China because China is politically risky, and Brazil and Chile, but look, Canada is not politically risky because we can trade with Canada. All using that to justify that can't depend on those, so we should be mining here anyway. So there's this fantasy, this illusion that, well, the frontier is actually over there. We can use the minerals and keep this trade ongoing with these other countries, and we can keep here our environment pristine as much as possible. That's not how capitalism works. There's the industry behind what we're calling green extractivism is looking to mine absolutely everywhere. So, for example, one of the colleagues there on the university, Max, is working on the fact that they're looking to the bottom of the ocean and saying that, well, there's manganese here, so let's mine for that. And it's international water, so it's up for grabs, right? Or even saying there are no conflicts, social conflicts here, because it's international waters, and who cares about the impacts of this in terms of biodiversity? And what it means to actually like having multinational corporations go to international waters and just think, hey, it's free, it's nature, I can come and I can take it as it pleases me, right? So last year, this conversation around these minerals for renewables actually got into the mainstream financial sector. And I'm gonna close with this last aspect of it. The World Bank released a report called Minerals for Climate Action, the Mineral Intensity of the Clean Energy Transition. And well, when the World Bank issues a report, we should be worried, because that usually means the financial system is getting prepared for something really big. They established that for a lot of the clean energy technologies, it means that the demand for a lot of minerals is going to grow by around 500%. For example, around graphene, lithium, and cobalt by 2050. And in this calculation, they left two things. They left a number of about 135 million individual electric vehicles that are expected to hit the market within the next 10 years. And I'd be thinking, good, we shouldn't include those because they shouldn't be in the market in the first place. We should be leading this towards another plan for mobility in the cities, reorganizing how people get from point A from point B. It shouldn't be about the way that Elon Musk wants to promote transition. But they also left out of their calculations about 840 million people in the planet who don't have steady access to electricity. So what's strange here is that they created these projections for growth and the level of abstraction that would be needed, and they never said that, well, we might have to cut back on other parts because we should make sure that these people have access to electricity first. It's not a priority at all. And even so, their numbers show that we'll need about 3 billion tons more of minerals in terms of extraction if we are to stay below 2.0 degrees Celsius, not 1.5. Okay? And that's like considering wind, solar, geothermal, and energy storage. Like we're talking here primarily about batteries, and batteries like stationary batteries, right? For our homes, for our hospitals, and batteries to deal with a very concrete problem that we have around renewables, which is intermittent access renewables. So like we've been having cloudy days, a lot of the solar panels are not capturing much. And so there are the wind turbines there. And we need to have electrical grids that are connected to the point that we're not going to be dealing with power outages. So where we have enough battery systems, but we're also connecting our generation one place to the consumption in another place. From this World Bank report, started conversations about a new super cycle of commodities related to green technology. And now we have like the Deutsche Bank making projections around this, and consulting firms like McKinsey, KPMG, because investors are getting very interested in what's happening right now. Which leads me to a huge concern about COP26. We already know that corporations make into official delegations of these companies. In 2011, I co-wrote a report when I was based at the Polaris Institute in Ottawa, in Canada, showing how corporations are within the delegations. They're within, like they have their hands all over the negotiation process. And not only the COPs, the conference of the party, the annual one, but like in the pre-meetings, they have beyond that. We had, like, for example, Shell within the Brazilian delegation for a few years under the Workers' Party, right? It wasn't even under like a right-wing party. And we know they also hold their parallel events. So we're going to have the People's Summit. I'm going to be at the People's Summit in Glasgow, but corporations also hold their parallel events, and they invite delegates from the countries to come in. They pay for things, very fancy events. So they do their own little lobbying when that happens as well. When you go to the Blue Zone there at the UNFCCC, when they have the accreditation for the environmental NGOs, and you can come here and you can speak. Well, it kind of looks like this huge like corporate fair sometimes, because you have these like little areas for every country, and then you're going to have like these what we call bingos, right? The business and industry NGOs, which is just another way of making sure that you have fossil fuels there, that you have the financial market there. And then they're trying to lure people into their false solutions every day. So this is pretty much business as usual. And no wonder that at The Economist, they were complaining that the IPCC report was overlooking geoengineering too much, that we should like pay more attention to this because it is part of their investment portfolio. And part of the portfolio is making sure that the rush for renewables that comes out of these green deals is also a way to create more profits for mining companies, rehabilitating mining companies that might not have a lot of room to work with when we're talking about like traditional mining, but they could justify investments in communities saying, well, but this is actually going to be geared towards renewables. So for example, at Aalborg, we saw a presentation about like by some researchers from Greece that they were talking about the Eldorado Canadian company in Greece, mostly mining for gold. But now they're saying, well, there's also copper, and copper is going to be, very good, because copper is very important for electricity transmission and generation. So yes, so it's a way of promoting new levels of greenwashing within the mining industry as well. To conclude, that means that our job is much harder than it seems, because even if we come like with all of these reports and know how bad the situation is, the market is adapting a lot faster than we are. That means that we need to get into proper conversations about alternatives, that sometimes we deal with some hard choices that we have to be made in terms of how we plan our lives, our cities, and our food production. And like the report, for example, they were quite clear about the fact that we need to start talking about plant-based diets, especially in the West, where they calculated that move towards a more, not even 100%, but like a more plant-based diet in the West could lead to 50% reduction in food-related greenhouse gas emissions from in the West, right? So like conversations that are not just about me making a change as an individual, but about collectives and how we understand how we produce food, where we put the minerals that we have access to, and that, well, green sacrifice zones is something that's actually unacceptable. So if we are going to need these minerals, and we will, I'm not saying we won't, we will need to, because we need to move towards renewables, we need to figure out a way of doing this responsibly and in coordination with the communities affected and the countries that have been suffering at the hands of imperialist interventions for a really long time right now, because there has been ecological imperialism in the global south for a long time to make sure that technological improvements and improvements in the capitalist system happen in the center of capitalism, but now they're actually trying to greenwash ecological imperialism by just saying that, well, Chile is just a little bit more lithium. And that sometimes happens with the support of the local governments, because these countries are so dependent on commodity production that these are seen as pathways to development. And this is really worrisome, and it requires a lot more articulation. So I hope we can get to more of this conversation at the People's Summit in Glasgow, because this calls for true internationalism and solidarity that goes beyond just saying that let's save the Amazon. Well, to save the Amazon, we have a lot of hard tasks at hand, and that requires us to treat this as a global problem that is not just about the agribusiness in the Amazon, but it's how we also manage demand and supply issues in other parts of the world. And I'm going to stop there.
Thank you very much, Sabrina. I'm sure there's a lot of thinking and questions afterwards, but at first I will pass on the floor to Varsna so that you can ask some questions that you probably.
So good evening, everyone. And firstly, let me say thank you to Inga and TransformDanmark, Noah, and Incorporated Global Action for organizing this, and of course to Sabrina for what has been a very rich presentation. I think you covered such a spectrum of different issues that are really important to our debates right now. And so what I'll try and do is maybe just spark off some of the things that you've already said and raise some other points related to that. Like I said, there's a lot. So I think what I'll do is just, if I can, pick up some of the themes that you brought out in your talk. For me, one of the first things and an underlying point you've made throughout is the question of equality, inequality, because climate change, what is changing? Justice. that's for me the thing we really need to talk about. I think I'd like to also then pick up a little bit on sort of false solutions, and also related to that, the COP, because we're going to see a lot of these false solutions put forward and rubber stamped at the COP. But I'd also, just because I am from South Africa, like to touch a bit on BRICS and sort of the importance of some of these discussions that are happening in BRICS. So yeah, I mean, Inga introduced me as from South Africa. I'm a researcher also in political ecology. I've been living in Sweden for 10 years and in Denmark for the last 2.5, almost 3 years. I work with a collective against environmental racism here in Copenhagen, but also at a global level with a Global Tapestry of Alternatives, which is looking for radical alternatives to sort of the capitalist, patriarchal, racist system that we live in. And I'm also involved in the COP26 coalition in organizing the People's Summit. So I think I'm going to try and relate to some of that part of it in terms of what activists need to think about, what everyday people need to think about, but also what we here in Denmark need to focus on. And I guess for me, one thing that struck me at the end, when you said us, is that we also really need to problematize who us is, because there's no one singular unifying us in this conversation. As you've mentioned, climate change divides people in huge ways, and that's where, for me, you know, the inequalities are so important. One thing that you talked about was consumption, and I think also for me, what's really interesting with renewables is that we're seeing energy addition rather than energy substitution, right? The growth of energy demand is huge. We're here in Scandinavia have a really comfortable lifestyle, and there is very little of that debate and discussion, which is really pushing for people to reduce consumption. I don't know if it was last year or 2 years ago, there was even a report partially financed by the meat sector in Denmark, promoting the idea that actually the emissions from meat was not as high and as problematic as before. So there is a huge industry push in that. We're also seeing that individualization that came up at the conference as well. We talked a little bit of issues, and I think it would be interesting to hear your thoughts on that. Sort of, how do we shift the conversation here to be more self-reflective? How to engage on collective action in that kind of solidarity that we're talking about? Because the bottom line is we need to reduce the consumption we have here. And that finger is not being pointed at us in the mirror. So just maybe some thoughts from you on that.
So that's excellent. Okay, there's a thing that I've noticed in a while. Like, I'm an eco-socialist, and in eco-socialism sometimes we have to deal, because we're dealing with the limits to Earth all the time in our activism. But I find that the socialist camp in general is really afraid of talking about consumption, because it seems like we're just going to, you know, pay lip service to these liberal approaches of, you know, individual change, buy local, organic, at this really fancy supermarket and things like that, right? And then we kind of just let it happen. And it got completely out of hand, because we didn't want to talk about consumption, because we want to point the fingers at the capitalist class. But if one thing that the capitalist class does really well is not only create supply, producing supply, but they create a demand. So there are ideological aspects here that need to be tackled. And they need to be tackled also ideologically, but also in terms of organization. How can we make sure that we build a different culture around it, showing material differences in terms of it? So when I was in Vienna, I was working with Professor Ulrich Brunn, and Ulrich published a book with Marcus Wissen called The Imperial Mode of Living. And this book has generated a lot of talk because they dare talk about consumption. It's like, you can't do that. That's a liberal thing. And consumption is not going to change anything. We need to change things at the supply side. Well, they never said that we shouldn't change things at the supply side, but we know that just the supply side is not going to be enough, because what if we go and we tackle things at the supply side, but people keep demanding more? Things are going to get out of hand, and that's why they get into climate denialism at a certain point. And this leaked report dealt with issues of consumption. The leaked report did say that individual, like action at the individual level in terms of consumption is not going to be enough, but it also needs to be approached, primarily in places where the quality of living is really high. By this, I don't mean that we should be reducing the quality of living. We should be rearranging what quality of living means, right? And one thing that Ulrich and Marcus talk about a lot is these, the whole thing around the car, right? I mentioned car mobility because I think cars are quite central to this. Just a few days ago, it was actually like the World Day without cars, right? And sometimes we bring this to the forefront because the cars have been really normalized as a system of convenience. And it's nice having it, and you should like change cars every now and then because they're fancy. And so they play a lot to this idea of like freedom under capitalism, and it has become quite normalized. So one of the things that I absolutely think in terms of consumption is that we need to target cars. Cars are a huge problem. But you can't target cars in cities without proper, high quality, affordable, I would say free public transit, right? So this is where the material part comes in, right? So I can tell people ideologically all the problems behind cars, but if I don't offer a proper alternative, I'm not going to change patterns around it. When I was in Vienna, we were actually getting into a conversation in terms of like how in the city, people really like public transportation, right? And one of the things that it kind of became a thing is that like you buy an annual pass, you buy it once, right? And then you just have it. So like I see a bus, I just walk into it, right? Because convenience helps a lot in terms of changing behavior patterns, right? So if with an annual pass you could do that, imagine if it was free. Then you could really make things a lot more convenient. And if you make things a lot more convenient, for me, that's an improvement in the quality of life. So a lot of the times when we're talking about these changes regarding climate change, we're talking about them in the sense that we're going to have to make things worse for you. Look, your life is too comfortable here, so let's cut back on the comfort. I say, let's rearrange your comfort around other things. So let's create more convenience. Let's have more open air markets with local food that's affordable, and let's shift all the subsidies towards that, not big farms, right? And not bringing food. I walked into a grocery store with Hans yesterday, right? And we pointed out, oh, look, these mangoes are from Brazil. And I've been in Europe, right? Since February when I went to Austria. I absolutely refuse to buy a mango from Brazil here. It seems absurd to me, and I love mangoes. And I'm sure a lot of you love mangoes, right? But you could even get mangoes from places that are closer. Why from Brazil, right? And sometimes I look through things and I see, well, for me, it's just as absurd as, making sure that in Brazil, when it's not peach season in Brazil, I will get peach from here. It doesn't make sense. So it means about how can we actually explore better our food systems, take more advantage out of it. You may be aware of this, but the majority of edible plants are not actually included in our culinary options in the entire world, because we have been conditioned by a system that told us that, well, food is about having wheat, having rice, having, potatoes, and these are the things that we should be making available. And this is just very convenient for those people who work with monocrops. So sometimes when I'm thinking about changes around food consumption, I shouldn't be thinking about what I'm getting out on my plate. It's like, wow, look at all this diversity that I never included before, right? I should mention, like for matters of disclosure, I am vegan. I have been involved in the anti-capitalist vegan movement in Brazil for a few years now. And one thing that we have learned is that there's no point, it makes absolutely no sense for me to talk about animal liberation in a country where people go hungry if I don't talk about food sovereignty first. I'm just going to be something very, a very stupid elitist person, and it's not going to help animals and it's not going to help humans, and I'm just going to be self-centered if I do so. So the creation of material conditions is quite important for when we talk about consumption. And this is not how the liberal approach has worked. The liberal approach normally works out making people feel embarrassed, about their consumption. And sometimes it's not really even changing the way people think about things. It's just like, it's like if I buy that, people are going to look at me, they're going to say I'm not very eco-friendly and things like that. And because of that, then it's very easy to sell eco-friendly stamps that they stamp on products everywhere. And to get those accreditations, then the companies pay money, and then you create another system for making money, which is through these little stamps, right? And that happens a lot with the vegan stamps around too. And then I had to sometimes remind people that, rice is vegan, you don't need to have a vegan stamp on absolutely everything, right? And something else I think can be quite interesting, like when we're talking about this matter of consumption, is that consumers could actually have a pretty powerful voice in tackling, planned obsolescence, right? So dealing with the fact that things are made to break. They are made to break. There's research even coming out of the European Union showing that appliances, household appliances are breaking much faster now than they did 20, 30 years ago. And the cost of repairing them is high. So people tend to just throw it away and buy something else. And when I was living, and this is the thing about living in the global south and the global north, because this contrast, you are aware of this, it's incredible. When I was living in Canada, I had a blender and that blender broke. And the fee to repair the blender was twice the price of a new blender. And I didn't understand that, because whenever my blender broke in Brazil, the fee to repair the blender was like 5 to 10% the cost of a new blender. And obviously that also has to do with the problem with cheap labor. But even if we adjusted the labor costs in Brazil, the parts were cheaper there. They were cheaper there because people are not going to buy a brand new one. They're not. But in the global north, that has been normalized, because sometimes when something breaks, it's an opportunity for an upgrade. I'm gonna get it home. My TV broke. It's time to get, it was 40 inches, I can get 60 inch TV, right? And it becomes normalized, then it kind of looks convenient. Something breaking justifies it ideologically for you, that you should do that.
It also brings up the whole e-waste issue.
Absolutely, and the e-waste is a problem also because, do you see e-waste when you walk around Copenhagen? Right? Sometimes you find the places where deposit your old batteries here and everything, but do you know where they get taken to? Where?
There's an old factory just outside Copenhagen who are handling old batteries from the whole country and splitting different elements into chemicals. And most of it is reused in other factories.
That's wonderful when they do that, because when they don't actually work through the cycle of things, they get taken to Bangladesh, right?
Don't do that actually.
Yeah. I'm just giving a general example around e-waste.
Denmark does do that with computers and mobile phones. So a lot of that does get shipped to West Africa.
Yeah, so they're gonna make it to other places, and usually you have toxic materials in them. And there are reports coming from the UN that show an increase in health problems in children in those areas because they're being exposed to this very toxic metals from it, right? But usually you don't see it. So you may have recycling programs in place here and there, but they're a small fraction of the problem. Because even so, it's not the actual companies doing a lot of this, right? They outsource it to some other company. There's usually not a lot of oversight, or it becomes a problem for the state. So the government needs to organize how things end up being recycled or not. considering this, it's also a problem of product design, right? Because it's not only planned obsolescence, but it's also the fact that there are products that are made not to be recycled. My laptop right here is one of those, in the sense that I bought this many years ago, and I thought that, well, when I can just like, you know, improve storage, because like I work with YouTube, so I need more storage for things, and the internet gets faster, so the quality that's expected is higher, so I need more terabytes in my computer. And then I go to the place and I say, well, I want to improve the storage in this computer. Oh, that's not possible. Like, why not? Oh, because now Apple actually makes sure everything is absolutely stuck to the motherboard. So you can't take a component out and put another component in. You need to replace the entire motherboard, which costs more than the computer, right? So the product design many times is made to, you know, make sure that you can't have modular approaches. And this leaked report talked about that. So like a push for like modular technology is what makes sense. That if you have a phone and, you know, a new camera technology improves, rather than, you know, change your entire phone, you just change the camera module, and the other one will have been designed to be able to be taken apart for smaller parts. They can be reutilized in other ways. So there are many aspects of this that connect production, but in a way or another, at the consumption level, people just kind of got comfortable ideologically with the idea that I shouldn't demand that the industry changes those things. And I actually don't expect anything from these capitalist companies because they just want to maximize profit. But we can have community pushes and we can have the people demanding regulations to make things more inconvenient for those companies. And hopefully building more class consciousness along the way so we can actually tackle the system as well. But in general, what it means that working towards building material conditions, making sure that we understand these changes in quality of living, not as reduction, but as rearrangements. And I think convenience is the main way to do it. Then we might actually like have room for reconciling some of these conflicts here. But again, that's not going to be easy.
Inga tells me that I don't have that much time.
Okay,
so what I'm going to do is, instead of putting a couple of questions to you, I'll rather make some statements.
Yeah, you should make some comments because I want to listen to you as well.
Right, and then get a response from you, because I think that might be more useful at the end of the day. Just though, picking up on what you said now, I think there's also a really important point in materiality about ecological and equal exchange, because we really don't engage sufficiently with that as climate activists here in the global north, with sort of talking about climate justice, talking about environmental justice and how that ties together. So yeah, we might be really good with batteries, but our old cars are going to Eastern Europe and other places, and so many other resources in that way. We might be trying to go for more vegan diets and diversifying, but there are problems with the amount of avocados and quinoa we're starting to eat that has impacts elsewhere in terms of the embodied land, labor, water that is part of that. So I think that there's a comment I'd like you to make, maybe in terms of also how we as climate activists in the North start to engage more in broadening, not just thinking about who's at risk as the future, but also about where we're having an impact elsewhere in the world. Then I wanted to kind of jump from there into sort of the false solutions, what you talked about in terms of geoengineering and elsewhere. There is this risk that there is such a push for these technology solutions to the extent that they're now built into the IPCC models, right? Technology that doesn't exist already is already planned to have an impact in the future. And one of the concerns I have with that is that, of course, we might need to have some technology solutions, but there's the risk of that neocolonialism that comes with it, right? Where are we going to do that? Where are we going to store the carbon? What are we going to take from the Sahara in terms of that? And so maybe a comment on that, but also tied to that, and I'm just throwing a whole lot of stuff at you right now. There's also what we're seeing, at least in Sweden with Sápmi, but also a concern for, say, Greenland, for Denmark, is what does that mean in terms of spaces like the Arctic, for those areas that have been underutilized in a way, that provide more space for wind power, that have other resources to draw from. And we are seeing all of these false solutions come with a further attack on indigenous way of life. But also, we're seeing sometimes from climate activism too much of a romanticization of the indigenous and the local, to the extent that we also appropriate it and use it in problematic ways. You know, I think you mentioned earlier at the lecture and learned about Buenvivir suddenly being used in different contexts. So thinking both on the neo-coloniality, but also what it means in terms of indigenous communities, in terms of the race for the Arctic and indigenous communities around that as well. And then picking up again on sort of the BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, sometimes thrown in there, sometimes not. I mean, there's a cause for concern. Things like the Belt and Road Initiative from China, we just heard how problematic that is. What's happening in Brazil, Russia, South Africa, not that good. So there is that sub-imperialism at work, like Patrick and Anna were talking about in an anti-capitalist critique of the BRICS. But I just wonder, you know, there's a people's forum around the BRICS that's happening soon. What kind of mobilizing and what kind of transnational solidarity is happening across those BRICS countries that's not from above, but the idea of the BRICS from below? Because I think that we also need to find ways to support what's happening in the global south and really support that transnational mobilization in a sense. And where do you see potentially spaces for us in Denmark to actually contribute to that? And then maybe just as the final sort of points around the COP, yeah, I'm not going to Glasgow. I also have a real concern about who's left out of the space. You know, right now with the vaccine apartheid, with the visa restrictions, that's really problematic. I think with the People's Summit, they're trying to bring in different spaces, but it's never going to be the same. But equally so, most of us are not expecting anything substantial to come out of the formal agreement itself. So how are we supposed to organize post COP26, knowing that that is not going to actually lead to any substantial change? Where are the opportunities? How can we do that? Things like climate ecological debt left out of the conversation, adaptation, loss and damage, kind of putting too much of resilience responsibility on the community. So how do we pick up as activists on this other way of doing things?
Yeah,
bunch of things.
No, but this last comment, I'm gonna have a photo that's excellent. Thank you. So I think I'm gonna start with it because it's gonna be exciting. So you may be aware that the UK decided which agencies are trustworthy and which ones are not when it comes to vaccines in the global south, right? So we're not going to, like, they're not recognizing any vaccine that was taken in Brazil because, well, the Anvisa agency is not trustworthy. So it could be Pfizer, AstraZeneca, all of the vaccines that are used in the UK. But, well, it was taken in Brazil, so we're going to treat those people as unvaccinated. So some of my comrades in Brazil who are planning on going, they're like, now we have to do this crazy quarantine if we have to go, and that incurs costs. And how we can afford this, because like the sterling pound is like 8 reais now. So it's absolutely, like, it's a prohibitive cost for many people in the global south. So that's the first part. At the People's Summit, what we're trying to do is like make things hybrid and things. I'm gonna be working like at the media hub there to make sure that people who don't come, they keep very informed in many languages and everything. But I think we also have another problem around this, which is more than just organizing post COP26. is the fact that we're still organizing on the UN calendar every year. Every year there's COP, and then we organize around COP. And then we start like next, oh, so it's going to be Cairo. So we need to plan how we're going to do things for Cairo. And it's like, it's going to be this one, it's like COP 50 and COP 60, and we're already in so much like problems that we're just thinking, yeah, let's meet again and let's meet again. And like going beyond the COP calendar and like not letting the UN negotiation that we know is very stale dictate how we organize, I think is one of the main challenges of like the global climate movement.
I do know some climate movements who have said they actually are turning their back on COP completely and are not actually thinking that we should give it any of our time and energy. Because you're right, a lot of resources are going towards that right now.
Exactly, and at the same time, there's a thing, if we boycott COP, we just let them run with the narrative, right? Because media is going to be paying attention to all that, and people still believe like the UN is still like the main body of international governance that people respect, right? With all of the problems within the UN, common people who are not aware of all of those contradictions and how the UN can also be a tool for imperialism, they just look, well, this is the climate negotiations, this is when we have the leaders. And there are a lot of things, there was like the big contradiction there, like with climate strike, right? It's like the greatest tweet, because she's like, we want to ask the leaders to approve the system. You can't ask the leaders anything to do that. We need to get rid of those guys, right? So it's something that it's hard to manage. Like, absolutely respect the people who are boycotting COP20. Well, I'm not even going to be at the COP, right? I'm at the summit. So like boycotting the calendar specifically, but we need to have a powerful alternative calendar. And I don't think we're quite there yet, right? That is mobilized, that has different nuclei in different countries, that we are quite connected. So if the IPCC gets to, connect to each other throughout the entire world to come up with these reports, why can't we do those things to come up with proper alternatives, right? So where is our system in place? Where is our international panel of climate change activists to make sure this happens? Obviously, I don't have an answer to that, right? This is something that we have to work on together to move on this. And since you mentioned apartheid, because there's the vaccine apartheid, we're moving to a state of equal apartheid. And something that I thought like should be one of the things that we focus on is that earlier in the year, when we had all those discussions around the TRIPS waiver for the vaccine, and like South African organizations were like a big leader in that discussion, I kept thinking like we need to work on our TRIPS waiver for technological transfer, right? To make sure that green tech doesn't stay all in the global north. Take the minerals, produce them here, sell them back to us much more expensive, right? The last time this was discussed at COP was 2010, right? And obviously these didn't make it to the resolutions because it means cutting to profit. And the idea is that if we cut into profit and we get rid of these patents, then we're not gonna have innovation, which is a lie. There's enough literature coming out from the people who work on the paradigm of delinkage that you can actually promote real technological innovation by investing in it through public subsidies, awards, and other things, making sure that you have researchers in public universities, because a lot of these patents that are being registered, new patents in green tech, they're actually there to serve the automobile industry. One of the biggest leaders in green tech patents right now is Mitsubishi. Right? So it's not even the type of innovation that we need that's going to serve our transition demands. And we need to change completely from that. And I think this should be like a main conversation, because the tech solutions involve this, the people who hold the property rights and the patents, which is something that we should be tackling in anything that's essential. Well, I want to get rid of private property in general, but anything that's essential should be like a priority right there, right? And the neocolonialism, because that encroaches on territories all the time, and not just in the sense of like where we're going to store all of this carbon, which is all you ask them is like, it's a technical problem. We need to figure it out. We're gonna do studies, right? And where are these studies, right?
I think it's really interesting that we talk about sacrifice zones, but we never talk about the fact that there are sacred zones. So like for agriculture, the western seaboard of the United States is some of the most fertile soil, but that means that we should be planting in New York and in Washington and in Boston, and actually not using it for people to live there, but to produce food. But that's a sacred zone that we would never get rid of.
Because we're overly obsessed with modernity in many ways, right? So like the way that a city is supposed to look like. Our references, like the main references for cities, we've seen them. They're in the Hollywood movies, right? They're chaotic. They're chaotic. And then you dare to move beyond that, and people think it's absolutely insane, right? And so like this redesigning is quite powerful. But when it comes to sacred zones of indigenous communities, then it's fine. Then it's fine to go there. So like these levels of neocolonialism are definitely a huge problem of that. But this matter on the romanticization of the indigenous, I think it's quite important too, because this is something that, for example, indigenous groups in Brazil have been quite open about. For example, they're using cell phones and computers, and now you have like indigenous influencers, and they're trying to get a message out there, and people are like, wow, but you're using all of this technology as if that was something that made them less indigenous because of that, right? And so there's this assumption that because Andean communities, centuries ago, we're talking about when we viewed in a certain way in Latin America, it means that, good living indigenous standpoint is everyone in these tiny little houses without, refrigeration or something like this, right? And that's not true, sometimes I think it's quite convenient to do this like fetishism of the indigenous voices, and we end up having some like instrumentalization and using them as the tokens, right? Okay, yeah, but we've got to be careful because like, this is indigenous territory, I want to keep it that way. And that leads to, for example, big environmental NGOs actually telling the indigenous communities what they can do or they cannot do with their territory. Remember that being a huge problem in Canada a while back, because some conservationist groups were actually saying, well, but you can't hunt here. And then you're turning to an indigenous community, you're telling them what they can and they cannot do with their own territory, or sometimes treating them as like stupid in the sense that they're not going to learn a new technique for planting, and thinking that, well, they can only grow food in a particular way. And actually, like some of the most, this is absurd, but like some of the most racist people towards indigenous communities that I've met in Brazil, they're involved in agroecology.
Of course.
It's like, I've heard like absurd things because, the indigenous don't know how to grow their food. And then, these, people come there with like mirrors and something, and it's like really racist things. And I had to like walk out from workshops because these guys who apparently hold the proper techniques for growing organic food just decided they hold all of the knowledge and they're the only people who should be heard. Yeah.
I've had climate activists in Denmark say to me that people of color don't care about environmental issues. And they were like, you're talking to me. This might be a problem in how you see the issues, not mine.
Yeah. And also like understanding, a lot of the premise around the discussion around environmental racism that we were talking about, the two of us earlier, has to do with the situation that there's this perception sometimes that communities where there's a lot of people of color, they're not as clean, or they produce too many plastic or things like that. But what's the infrastructure budget for those places? How are they actually approached? What is, like the programs that are implemented in those areas? So like when Dr. Bullard, Robert Bullard, came up with the concept around environmental racism in the discussion of environmental justice, was actually showing like what resources, public resources were devoted to Black communities in the United States and to white communities. And the difference was that when it was a time to just like put a dump somewhere to get rid of the garbage, they put it close to the Black community. And then people just associated about, look, those Black communities, they create a lot of garbage, right? And such things. So there's a lot of rethinking that has to be done around that. And just to close off with a little thing around BRICS itself. A lot of things on BRICS is that, for example, when was Lula on BRICS was something, when it's Bolsanaro on BRICS is something else, right? So we need to understand that the project itself has a lot of issues with sub-imperialism and this notion of expansion, but also who's in power in each country actually does matter a lot. And there's a general proposal in the sense that we're dealing with underdevelopment and we should have a little bit of a counter-hegemonic project there. The problem is that it's completely permeated by the capitalist system. So they end up replicating the same methods of these imperialist organizations from the north, right? So it's like BRICS, but it's sort of like thinking in terms of how NATO works and NAFTA works and not really thinking in terms of alternatives. Out of these groups here, well, India has Modi right now, right? So like Modi and Bolsonaro is an absolute mess in this point in terms of like how they're thinking ecologically, right? And there are contradictions in Russia right now. China is a body of contradictions because there are a lot of advancements on the one hand, but a lot of like extraction and dispossession on the other hand, and projects outside of that as well. South Africa is a country for mining for a lot of the green extractivism. So there's a lot to be thought about in this sense. But then that's what I think, like, if you can get like groups like working class and communities and movements from these countries to agree on things, when they do a people's forum, we can actually come up with like very well coordinated agendas. So that's why I think like it's good that we boycott some spaces, but it's also good that we use some of these spaces to, okay, let's get together and let's make counterpoints here. Otherwise, it's just the hegemonic discourse that's going to be heard and going to be thought of as absolutely normal. Yeah.
I mean, as you said, it is very complex, but that is also the opportunity that we don't try and fight it just on our own. We also have to have that solidarity and that transnational organizing on several fronts, not just on climate change, but on all of the issues together. I think you and I could keep talking for a really long time.
Yeah.
But I think there are many other people who have.
And I actually promised a break.
Yes.
Because there's some coffee over here, and there's some water, and there's some books. So I will give you 10 minutes, and then we will have.
I have a very sort of basic, but maybe not question, for somebody who's from the Philippines and plans to operate in, which is the second most dangerous country to be an activist in after Brazil. I'm from the most dangerous part of the Philippines, in the south. How does one operate safely without the reality of being shot in such an environment, and especially with regards to mobilizing the local people and engaging them and making yourself a public figure, which in my mind would probably also make me a target.
Should we take with their more complicated?
Yes, I think we should take 2 or 3 questions. Yes.
Yeah. The first frame for the question is, what went wrong in Brazil? And then I have like,
how many hours do we have?
then I have like, I would like to further add on it. I was part of the top 15 here in Copenhagen. We had it in December 2009. And I remember that Lula, he was president back then. He participated, he was there also. But for around a year, since 2008, they began speaking about, we are gonna be more people on the planet. They were like 7 billion around 2009, maybe a little less. And they said, we're going to be at least 9 billion, maybe 10 or even 11. So we need a lot of food. And then Lula said, we can be the food garden of the world. So is that a politics that run through the government, that Brazil still think that it's okay to cut the forest because we need food for the growing population on Earth?
Yes.
Yeah.
Any questions online?
Are there any questions online?
No questions online so far.
So I think that can begin with these 2.
Yeah, we take these 2.
Yeah, thank you for the questions. Yes, so like Brazil, Colombia, Philippines, the worst place was on earth, especially around environmental activism, right? The biggest danger are for those working in areas quite connected to territory, right? So close to the forest and close to rural areas, dealing with these conflicts with like large landowners against peasants. So the majority of the assassinations usually happen in those circumstances, or just being indigenous, right? Like the danger of being an indigenous person in general. There are some conversations around this, like in some of like the groups that do this kind of work on how can work in terms of matters of self-defense. That since we're online, I'm not gonna get directly into it, but we have found that sometimes visibility actually helps rather than makes it worse. I'm speaking to you as a person who has a lot of visibility and gets a lot of death threats, but I also get protected from a lot of these threats by having visibility, because then you have the opportunity to denounce some of these things. I don't go to territory very often anymore. And I don't live in one of those territories. I live in a city. So for me, it's not that dangerous. But for the people who actually live in these territories, a lot of the danger sometimes happens even if you're not even an activist. It's just because you're in a territory that they want to encroach on. And that makes it quite complicated. I think that in the Philippines is actually a little worse than in Brazil, because Duterte makes calls for this kind of violence quite right away. Bolsanaro does it, but sort of implied. I'm going to give them more guns, right? It's important. Or these, the people from the Landesbrückers movement, they're like criminals. We need to get rid of them. Whereas Duterte has made direct calls for like killings and reading people, like reading of them like quite literally, physically. So I think, yes, it's quite more dangerous in the Philippines in that sense, and I'll compare it more to the situation in the rural areas of Colombia. That said, I know, for example, through Via Campesina, the Pastoral Commission of Earth, there are organizations that be quite active in trying to make sure that when you have an activist that it's being very threatened or the situation is getting bad, how you can get them under protection, right? So either like moving out of the country or in different areas, things like that. But I don't think there's like perfect safety when you're an activist. It could be like really random things that could happen to you. It could be someone who posted a threat, about you in a forum, and one day they decided to act on it. So it is a risk that we take. It is a risk that's very present for those who live and work directly in these contested territories, and they are aware of it, right? So maybe that means that when we're talking about mobilization, solidarity should be a main effect here, right? And like the more people that we have, the easier it is for us to spread out the attention around it. It's important for us to have leaders, like voices that we single out and can be references and can be even symbolic for struggle, because people will identify with that one person and they'll be inspired and they will come, but we cannot rely just on those people. It's going to be dangerous for them. It can lead to personalism. It can become overly centralized. It can create hierarchies that are undesirable. So the more people that we have and the more voices that we can spread out in that sense, I think that helps. And never ever engage in activism by yourself. First of all, it never leads to change, right? It's very risky and it never leads to change. So my general advice that, for example, what is your collective? Who are your people? And how can you, with your people, devise safety strategies around this? Like I know people in Brazil, like who have been murdered, like people that I knew because of their activism, or who had been arrested many times because of this. And sometimes, and this is like my personal perspective here, sometimes the people who are like very much at risk, sometimes it's okay to step back and let other people take over for a while and watch for yourself, because I've said this a couple of times before, but like dead bodies don't make a revolution. right? So you also need to have a little bit of self-care. And I think this is like a lesson that's very strong in the eco-feminist movement, right? Yeah, we have to be brave, but we can't get, into a level like mistaking bravery for just being completely imprudent in the things that are in the actions that you take.
Can I just pick
Yes,
up
go
on
ahead.
that? Because I mean, I think what you raise is such an important point in all three of our countries. That's a reality. And I think that that's also something important for everyone else to think about, because that is not the reality of being an activist in Denmark or in Sweden. And there is also a number of things that people are dealing with that maybe they don't always are engaging in being a part of XR, right? Because they have fears and they have histories of knowing what it is like and traumas from being in other places that also affects the way they can interact. So I think that consciousness of what it means to put your life on the line is something that we have to be aware that it's not the same for everyone. But also, I mean, a friend from Global Aktion, we were just talking during the break about the fact that Global Aktion is putting money towards bodyguards for activists in South Africa. So there are also ways that the support needs to happen. And like you said, it's about having that community of support around it as well. But it is a very different experience to be an Earth Defender in Philippines than it is to be an Earth Defender here. And I do recommend everyone read that Global Witness report, because it is just scary to think about.
And just to finish off on that, because now it just made me think of something else, diversity of tactics. There's not like a formula on how to do these things, right? So, civil disobedience here is very different from civil disobedience in Brazil, right? Getting arrested by the police here is very different from getting arrested from
if you have the right passport and the right color.
Yes, exactly, right? So it depends on intersectionalities where you are, and in Brazil as well, right? Because like my former partner got arrested twice defending an occupation in Brazil, and he got a lot of threats from the cops, and it was a really tense situation, but he's white, so we were able to create a whole situation and raise money to get him out on bail. If he had been black, he would not have been out on bail, and he would have had a really hard time in jail. And this happened to another friend who was black, who was involved with symbolically burning one of the racist statues in Brazil. And what they did to Galo was absolutely abusive. But we're talking about a black guy from the favela, which was not the case with my ex-partner, right? And that makes a huge difference. So in every place, there's going to be these intersectionalities. And when we consider Global South and Global North, even more, because the police establishment works differently throughout the world, right? So diversity of tactics is good. And when you're, you should understand who you are, if you're a woman of color, if you're like a white person in a country that's safer, or or a place that's very racist, you need to really understand how it is. And with your collective, put yourself in a position that I'm going to evaluate how can I serve the movement here according to what's safer for me too. And then capitalism has international division of labor. We need to have division of labor in our collectives as well, looking out for each other. And I think that helps a little too. What went wrong in Brazil? So in the 1500s, there's more recently, the rise of the far right in Brazil is quite connected to, fundamentalist churches. It's connected to agribusiness getting way too comfortable. So they took a lot of advantage when they were under Lula, but it wasn't enough, because they want to grow the agricultural frontier. I come from a part of the country that's actually considered, a big farm state. The whole state is seen as a farm. They treat us as we're all pigs from the countryside and things like that, because it's a place for you to grow soy and rice and beans, and that's pretty much it. Status in the city where I come from is like people who say, they own a farm, or they're, relatives of someone who owns a farm. And when they talk about farms, they're talking about really, really large landowners, because in Brazil, we have
faciendas.
Yes, yeah. So it's basically like private property in Brazil is very much connected, not just thinking, oh, I own a house or something. It's absolutely ginormous amounts of land. It's things that are like size of some of the states here, like some of the countries in Europe. There are places like that are owned by one person or one family in Brazil. And that means agribusiness is quite a powerful class that sometimes gets undermined because it's not your regular industrial capitalist class. And Lula had a strategy that I criticize a lot, like class conciliation, thinking that he could promote a little bit of agrarian reform on one side, but also keep agribusiness happy on the other side. So when the budget would come out every year, there will be funds for for family agriculture, and there will be funds for agribusiness through the Safra program. And that made sure that this class that was already very powerful was still powerful and more powerful and even more established. The conversation about too many people is a lot of panicky, right, around it. I do agree that we need to talk about populational growth because it means resource distribution. So we shouldn't just think this is a no problem. It was a thing when, it was ridiculous when Malthus was talking about it, but not every conversation about populational growth has to be neo-Malthusianism, right? We need to be responsible. Projections put us at about 11 billion at the end of the century, and then it stabilizes. But that's a lot of people. And, we're going to go grow food, and we need to grow food more efficiently. We're going to make sure that we don't have all this virtual water just passing from one place to another, because that's also a way of depleting resources, right?
But can I also just throw in here, it is a myth that these big agricultural companies feed the world.
Yes.
Yes. So small scale farmers feed more of the world, right? So what are they producing? They're producing the kind of luxury foods that we're over consuming, and a few of us are. And I think it's really important. There's the carbon inequality report that really shows some of these, but also the work that Grain has been doing. So
yes,
just like these myths that we can do the world. Well, who's the we, and what are you getting out of that, and who are you feeding?
And some of the people feeding those myths is Agra.
Exactly.
Right?
It's
so
Gates
Foundation everywhere, right? And in Brazil, we actually have the data, right? That about 70% of staple foods in Brazil are produced by small-scale agriculture because agribusiness, they produce commodities, right? Things are going to be shipped somewhere else. And the main commodity is soy, particularly soy that's going to be used either for industrialized products or to become food for livestock, right? Somewhere else. And this is something to always consider. But Lula kind of just bought into this whole thing of like trying to keep things stable. We're gonna have a little bit of family agriculture here and some of the agribusiness later. Agribusiness ended up later with Dilma, it ended up directly in the Ministry of Agriculture with Cátia Abreu. And then one thing that connects to this is that just a couple of weeks ago, and I was talking in Lund about this, is that Lula is still promoting this idea that we have to work with agribusiness. Yes, I know they want, we want agrarian reform and they want guns to kill people who want agrarian reform, but we have to work with them. That was all within 280 characters of a tweet. And I was like, how can you read something so simple and not understand that it's an absolute contradiction and absolutely impossible? We have to work with agribusiness. We want agrarian reform and they want to kill people who want agrarian reform, but we have to work with agribusiness. You can't move on from that. Like there's no class conciliation possible in that sense. So I think a lot of the things, like many things went wrong in Brazil, but one of the major things that went wrong in Brazil is that we never actually properly had slavery abolition. Like it wasn't properly abolished. It was a system to make sure that would have a mass of Black workers to be overexploited in cities, and we never did agrarian reform. And you can trace that to Bolsanaro rising to power with all the support from agribusiness, from the gun lobby, from the fundamentalist evangelicals, and with the traditional rights thinking that if we want to get rid of the Workers' Party because we want to have even more drastic neoliberal positions here, and well, we are going to have to work with the guy like Bolsonaro. And up until now, they think it's worthwhile to keep Bolsonaro there. Because believe me, like if the Brazilian capitalist class wanted to get rid of Bolsonaro, that would have happened yesterday. They don't want to. You know, they can snap their fingers. They're that powerful in Congress that they could get rid of Bolsonaro. But as long as Bolsonaro stays very faithful to the austerity agenda, they'll keep him there. And they're just hoping that next year they can provide an alternative to Bolsonaro that's not Lula. When it comes just between Bolsonaro and Lula, they might just, you know, paint Bolsonaro as something who got reformed and it's a little bit more moderate now, and let's give him another chance. Because the point there, and like the coup against Dilma Rousseff was around neoliberal reforms more than anything. Many reasons, but the neoliberal reforms was a huge aspect, making sure they could privatize everything, and they've been selling everything. You know, parts of Petrobras, they've been selling the post office company, how we manage the electricity grid, and if like selling Eletrobras is just a way to show that how can we actually like push towards full renewables in the electricity grid if it's in the hands of private companies, right?
But maybe I can also just be a bit cheeky here and say what went wrong with Brazil is no surprise. It's just a reflection of a pattern that is happening all over the world, right? And the Pandora Papers now are just again showing us that how capitalism
works. Yes, our finance minister,
yeah,
Paulo Guedes is involved in that.
So it's just different patterns replicated everywhere, and it's everywhere. It's not just in Brazil or South Africa or Russia. It is also what we're seeing in Europe as well, in how business can dictate so much of the agendas.
I have a question from Zoom, and someone would like to hear if you have an opinion about Western and white people traveling from the North to the South America to volunteer or help and understand the situation better. Is there a way that this can be done in a way that is free from colonialistic ideas without the sense of the white savior coming to lend a hand to our Southern brothers and sisters?
That's a good question and an important self-reflection.
Yeah. Do you want to tackle that first? Because volunteerism is really big in Africa, right? Yeah.
I mean, firstly, the fact that we ask that question is absolutely essential, because we have to be aware of the privileges and the risks of the white man's burden that we have to save the world. But that does not, so yeah, so there are a lot of those examples which are kind of like a form of tourism. I go in, I work
with agencies.
Yeah, I take lots of pictures for Instagram and then I'm out of there. But absolutely, every one of us can make a difference anywhere. It's how we approach it, I believe. It's that we go there with humility, with not presuming we understand what is happening there or know what the answers are for there, but that we listen and we be good allies and we make the space for other people in how we do that. And I think that should apply anywhere that we are working. So there is a risk, yes, but I think that I also know amazing activists who are working in Africa, who are coming from Denmark, who are doing amazing things there. And I would never say that they shouldn't be there. But I would say that if any of us goes anywhere, we do so with humility, we listen first, and we take the lead from other people. That's really key. And yeah, try and stay away from these like marketed volunteer programs where you pay money to volunteer. That's usually a red flag that there's something wrong.
There's a thing that I think there are like movements, organizations, and sometimes even like countries that have like solidarity brigades. And like it's a way of actually like inviting people, come in, we can show you how it is. Maybe we can exchange ideas. Cuba does this a lot, right? There are like solidarity brigades with Cuba a lot. And with the MST, the Language Workers Movement in Brazil, they're very, like, they tend to welcome people. But a good way to bridge this is usually like, organize yourself where you are, like in your country. Be part of a collective, you know, don't do things just by yourself. Then let's see, like, go somewhere as part of like representing that collective. because that way you can go, you can have that experience, and it can also bring something back to other people, and maybe things that you learned here, you take it there, and then that becomes a much more fruitful exchange than rather just, you know, making a trip by yourself. And a lot of the movements like doing this, and like it's one of the things that when I was in Palestine a couple of years ago, right, I would see like MSD flags everywhere, because, you know, they actually do this thing, like, you know, these youth groups from Palestine, they go to Brazil, and then the Brazilian language youth, they go to Palestine and they learn things together. So there are ways of doing this that are very like politically motivated and very enriching, and stays for a lifetime more than just an individual experience.
I must also say that I have a colleague of mine in Women Against Extractivism in Africa who said very clearly, I can't quote her exactly, but she's like, if you really want to help us, sort out your own problems. Yeah, that is actually the best help that we can achieve.
There's a question down there. Yes, please.
Do you know, it's not like having numbers, but what is the stream, in which direction is activism going? Because tonight, for example, I don't see any young people from high school, and I don't see a lot of people. So what is, I just came home to Denmark. I've been living in France for 15 years, but what is where are we going in activism?
But I can speak to how things are organized in Denmark, and like you mentioned dynamics, right? Different places have different dynamics. I know, like, the majority of my activism is actually people a lot younger than me. So like I'm one of like the older people in my cohort, right? Like, but it really depends like on the issues, organizations involved, and I actually think it's good for us to think like there are spaces and spaces, right? And one thing that I find that is working in terms of activism is actually like hands-on stuff. You know, I think it's all fine, like come here, chat, we're exchanging knowledge and things like that. But those are like, in Brazil, I don't like doing those things anymore. Like I usually like, invite me to go do something with your collective. You know, let's go do something, we can talk as we're doing this. I'm gonna learn throughout the process, because, you know, otherwise everything feels a little bit too academic, and I already have a life in academia to fulfill that aspect of my life, right? So it's good to have a little bit of a like balance between these things. And I think that when it comes to the climate movement itself, I find the little bit that I've been looking into it, it's going through this period of resurgence now after the pandemic, of, you know, kids reorganizing and getting out in the streets again. I think that's quite positive. And in Brazil in particular, we are still in this tendency of like fighting for vaccines and against denialism, and because the pandemic is so bad in Brazil, that mobilizing around climate kind of fell on the back burner. But we had a good turnout at the climate strike. I thought that was actually quite positive. It was a lot more people than I expected, to be honest. So I think like people are trying to figure out, like when we think like where we're going with activism, we need to think where we're going with activism in this post-pandemic scenario, especially in places that are not post-pandemic at all. And I think the United States has a huge challenge because deaths are growing like crazy again, right? Now in just in September, I think they had close to 60,000 deaths. So they had gone down to July to 9,000 deaths in July to almost 60,000 now, because they started vaccinating, but there's the anti-vax movement, and then they just lift off all of the restrictions without waiting for it to come to like a proper level, and it's getting out of control. And at the same time, people need to mobilize, but people are not wearing masks anymore. So all of the countries, the movements are having to kind of like fend for themselves and figure out how can we actually navigate this scenario when in certain cases, mobilization or being in the room is still quite not possible yet. Like I couldn't have this in Brazil yet, right? Even with masks, there's not enough ventilation in this room to be safe in the Brazilian scenario because you don't have free testing. So people couldn't make sure that they tested before coming to the space. And so I think we're going to have still a lot of difficulties. I think this speaks also to what's happening regarding Oslo, right? A lot of people from the global south that we wanted to go there won't be able to go there because we're dealing with these, horrible racist, like it's institutional racism coming from the UK government right now. But I'm hopeful that it's very intergenerational now, right? Especially around climate, is youth took the lead, yes, Greta has something to do with this, but it didn't begin with her. We've had youth in the global south for a really long time worried about what's going to happen, and I think part of the reason why I've been mobilizing around youth for a really long time, because whenever I went to schools to talk about climate change, they took it very seriously. We've had projects, for example, going to schools and talking about water privatization. So high school students always took it very seriously before Greta did her first strike. And so what's happening right now is that this is just becoming more and more visible, and then it's joining the ranks. This might lead to some conflicts because, I have conflicts with my parents, that's normal. But it's positive that we're understanding levels of intergenerational solidarity and things like that. And the understanding that the future is actually tomorrow too. It's not just 20, 30 years from now. So everyone here is kind of involved in a way.
I can just share my perspective on it. So it's my perception, and I welcome anyone who thinks it's different. But I can see a couple of trends for me in this. One is that I feel in Denmark, there is still a segregation of activism, right? So there's the Black Lives Matter demo, and then there's the climate march, and then there's the close the camps, and sometimes they're talking to each other, not always. Certainly how they're reported in the media, how they're represented are very, very different, all of that. So that kind of segregation of activism is happening. Another thing is that there is a risk of a depoliticization of activism, where there's a lot of people who are happy to join the demonstration with their grandma and their kids and whatever, but it ends with that. I walked in the Pride or something like that. So sometimes there's a little bit of concern for me that when it comes to tackling the hard political questions about it, people shy away.
Kind of boring, so let's not do that.
Also, because people here don't want to often get into conflict. That's not the thing to do. So there is partly that happening. But another area where I am seeing activism growing is that there is a serious engagement happening from people based on what is happening in my life and how things are changing. Now, obviously, in lots of places in the world, that's because of floods or whatever. But interesting things like, the Yellow Vest movement in France, but Benzino brought it in Sweden. Rural people saying, well, hang on, these higher prices on diesel, problematic. They're not opposed to a transition, but they want it done in a different way. The same with workers, right? They are mobilizing, but they're saying, don't make us be in conflict with you about climate change. Let's try to find some other path that is about a just transition. So there's also that different kind of mobilizing that I'm seeing. I had a fourth point I was going to make about activism in Denmark, but I can't remember it now. But those are my perceptions, at least, of some of the trends that I'm seeing.
I have a few more things to add about what you said about going to protest, and then that's it. I read a report that said 75% of Danish youth is politically engaged, which they defined as making considerations in the supermarket as to what products you purchase and discuss politics at the dinner table at home. So I would say the bar is quite low.
But it would be interesting to see how many of them vote, right? And how they actually also associate issues that they say are important to them to how they vote. And I mean, we're coming up to the local elections now. These are critical issues that we should be talking about, and we should be in a room with a much more diverse audience. And yeah, I mean, there are people trying to organize, we are trying to organize around that, but it's still limited.
Yes.
I don't know if you know this, but there's a delegation of the Zapatistas right now in Copenhagen, and we had.
I missed dinner with them on Saturday. It was very sad.
Yeah. They were also on Sunday, well, both Friday, Saturday, and Sunday in these 6-hour.
We were at the Danish Marxist Studies Conference.
Yeah. Yes.
But sorry.
Yeah, no, but it was just, we had such an interesting discussion on Sunday about this exact matter on like the difference, like activism, like why, how can we learn from each other, but like also how our circumstances so different from chapters and to here. So this, that, like where they are in their ways of living, they see the consequences of all the problems of the world so directly, but whereas us, we have outsourced our problems to other places. So a lot of the kind of activism that we can do here is solidarity activism, and that kind of ends when the demo ends. So, so we see a lot of this kind of hobby activism, and we talked about all in this room how draining that also is, because it's so half-hearted, and so we kind of need we need to develop strategies on how we can do activism that is actually dedicated and that has more sort of impact, and it's not just symbolic activism, because whenever we do that, we feel that it's so much stronger. Like when we, for example, go to the Energielente and close down coal mines, that is something that has a direct impact, and that is so much more powerful. So it's really interesting to like how we can the differences of these global south and global north approaches to creating autonomy architectures.
Yeah, in the end, like the matter of international solidarity is quite simple. Go after your governments and your corporations, right? Name names. That's one of the main things. So right now, just like in Berlin, we had the referendum around the expropriation, and the referendum won, even though the left didn't do very well. In the city, the referendum to expropriate like the main companies that held like tons of like thousands and thousands of residential units in a city where rent is so hard to afford right now, it won. And for me, it was, well, I know why it won. It was very direct. It said like people feel the pressure, they know it's like expensive and the apartments are bad and all these things. So when you say that Deutsche Wohnen owns over 100,000 residential units in the city and they're making your life miserable, let's expropriate Deutsche Wohnen. And a lot of people say that's insane. People are not going to vote to expropriate a company, like private property, expropriate capital. Yes, they voted to expropriate capital because they're suffering at the hands of that. So like name names. For me, it's a lot simpler than like, oh, the fossil fuel industry. Let's talk about the names here, right? Like in Brazil, it sometimes is kind of odd because we're also talking about the national oil company. But I can talk about the managers of the national oil company. They are serving other interests that are not actually like transition, right? And when I'm talking about the food industry in Brazil, I'm talking about JBS, I'm talking about Ambev, and then I go and I make a video and I'm like, let me introduce you to the billionaires of this country. You need to know their names and their faces because we're coming after these people and you need to know who they are. And I think that gives more purpose to campaigns and mobilizations rather than just like I said, marching from point A to point B to save the Amazon, right? That's not going to save the Amazon, right? But if you go after, mining companies and here I think that something that's quite powerful is the financial system, because a lot of the consulting companies here and a lot of the banks here, they have huge stakes in these big farms in Brazil. Right now, there's a new level of land grabbing. Like usually when we talk about land grabbing, we think about, this corporation went there and they took a piece of land. What they do is that they do these investment packages. and then you can own a part of it and like have so much return for so many years. And you know, sometimes that's embedded within the pension funds here. And like that makes it like something that we need to talk about, like pension funds and unions and how you like plan your retirement and things like that. Sometimes what we're talking about is like huge campaigns around divestment, you know, and like that it is a like the divestment is actually not that hard to organize, like, and it's easy to build awareness around it. So you like, where is your money going and things like that, and what are the banks that are like profiting from it? So maybe what you need to do is like map out what are the banks that are profiting from these issues in this place and that place and that place.
We had a successful campaign of that sort a few years ago with one of the biggest pension funds here that has had money in coal mines in Colombia, and this group called Colombia Solidarity actually managed to divest.
See, success story because the name and went after it. Like we need to have like more you know, targets people can see, right? Because like even though like, oh, anti-capitalism, people can see capitalism, but they also live under capitalism. So if we name the targets and we show that the targets live in places very different from where you live, then you build antagonism, and that makes it a little easier.
But I mean, let's not forget Danske Bank, Nordea Bank, now Yes Bank. We also have a lot of them to think about in their accountable.
The Mercosur trade agreement.
Yeah.
Yes, the EU-Mercosur agreement is a
The EU agreements are horrible.
Yeah.
Before we end, and we are nearing the end, or you will get very tired. I would like to make some conclusions. But I wish to mention before you make your conclusions that one of the organizers of this meeting is NOAA, Friends of the Earth. And they actually started in this country in '69, doing environmental, dealing with environmental issues, and they actually achieved a lot.
Like the early environmental movement has a lot of success stories, right? And but what is a little sad is that for a while people kind of just forgot about it because of, you know, modernity and these false green solutions, because there was a lot of greenwashing and a lot of cooptation too. But yeah, that's it. Well, I don't know if I have that much to add. Like we talked about a lot of different things. So I guess I'm just gonna thank you for your presence, for staying longer. And tomorrow there's a talk at the University of Copenhagen as well at 10:15 a.m. And I'm gonna be more focused on concrete things, the concrete path of destruction of the environment in Brazil coming out of the Bolsanaro government. And I'll try to actually like summarize that so it fits into like a shorter lecture, because it's a lot of stuff. But anyway, thank you for coming, and thank you to the organizers. It's been a pleasure being here.
Thanks a lot.